We saw in our first talk, where we looked at the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, that the nation of Israel were promised either blessings or cursings, depending upon whether or not they would obey the voice of the Lord their God. He predicted that if they disobeyed, then they would be disinherited from the land, scattered among every nation, and that in those nations they would find no rest and always be in trouble. However, Moses doesn't leave it there. Moses goes on in the 29th chapter and the 30th chapter to explain other events that will happen. And he says that because of this that happens, that the nation will be cast out of the land because of their disobedience, other nations will look upon them and say, well, what nation is like this? So we read in the 29th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, and the whole land thereof is brimstone, salt and burning, that is not sown, nor beareth, nor any grass groweth thereon, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. Even all nations shall say, wherefore hath the Lord done this unto his land, and what means the heat of his great anger? So people will look upon the land in its desolation, and they will say, what's going on here? Why has this happened? Moses goes on to explain it's because of their disobedience. When he comes, however, to the 30th chapter, he says that's not the ultimate end. The Jews scattered and the nation and the land made desolate. He goes on to say the time would come when God would reverse the very things that had happened. So we find in the 30th chapter, and at verse 1, it says this, it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessings and the curse, which I shall set before thee, thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee. In other words, when it's all happened, they'll look back in times after that and say, well, God said this would happen to us. Surely it's written in the book. In the next verse, he goes on to say, and shall return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey his voice according to all I command thee this day, thou and thy children with all thine heart, with all thy soul, that then the Lord thy God will return thy captivity, have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. Now that's like, how more plain English could you use to describe the intention of God here? When you wake up what's going on, then I'm going to gather you back from all the nations that I've scattered you. I'm going to gather you back into your own land. I am going to do it, says God. In the next verse, he makes some other statements, which read as follows. If any of thine be driven out unto the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring you into the land, which he promised, I think I get this right, which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it. He will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. Now, isn't that amazing? Now remember that this prophecy is 3,500 years old. And I say, where else in the world, what other book, what other nationality, what other religion has ever seen fit or game enough to predict what will happen to them in 50 years, in 100 years, 1,000 years, 3,500 years? Who would be game? What other prophecies are there that we could depend upon? There are none. These are the only ones. So what importance can we place upon the prophecies of the Bible? Firstly, God says, I will scatter. I will send you into the land, into other lands. The land will become desolate. People will wonder why it's all happened. When it does, God will determine at a particular time to bring the nation back. Their ultimate end is to be regathered. Now, it goes even further than that, because the regathering of Israel at the moment is not totally fulfilled in what the prophecy has to say. So I draw your attention to the very next verse. And the very next verse has this to say: "And the Lord thy God will then circumcise thine heart and the heart of thy seed to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. And the Lord thy God will put all these curses upon your enemies and on them that hate thee, which persecute you. And thou shalt return and obey the voice of the Lord, and do all his commandments, which I command thee this day." Now, although the Jews and Israel have returned to the land, they have repopulated, they've got thriving businesses there, they are surrounded on every hand by their enemies, and they fight for their existence. They have not turned to the Lord their God with all their heart. Their heart is not circumcised. Their heart is not true with God. They are not doing all of God's commandments. In fact, the nation is basically irreligious. It doesn't really care that much. There is a small group who try to keep the commandments of Moses according to their traditions of the fathers, but basically as a nation, they don't. So although the Jews have returned to the land, those last verses that I read to you are yet to happen. There's a time coming when the Jewish nation, with all their heart, will turn and obey the voice of the Lord their God. How this will happen will be the subject of some of our later talks in relation to the future of Israel.